Welcome to What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, the podcast for both doctors and patients with me, Liz Tucker. This week, I'm talking to journalist Tom Mueller, who, after meeting whistleblowers working in the US dialysis industry, decided to investigate further. Tom argues what he found is a cautionary tale, not just about dialysis, but about the impact on healthcare of for-profit medicine in general. His book, How to Make a Killing, Death, Dollars, and the Business of Blood, contains one statistic that I found extraordinary. Although the US has one of the most sophisticated healthcare systems in the world, around 22% of US dialysis patients die each year. Yet in Europe, the figure is only 9 to 12%. So I wanted to find out what could possibly explain this. And I should be clear, before publication, Tom contacted organisations involved in the US dialysis industry about the allegations contained in his book. Most did not respond, but DaVita, one of the two major companies responsible for 80% of US dialysis healthcare, did. It said that its company's principles rendered many of Tom's assumptions incorrect or downright impossible. It states that patient welfare is paramount in its facilities and says the first consideration in every decision we make is patient safety. We are committed to providing a comfortable therapeutic environment for all patients. But before we get to the detail of Tom's interview, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at Liz C. Tucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. And now back to Tom's interview. Tom Mueller is a journalist and author. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Atlantic Monthly, and many other publications. Previous books include Crisis of Conscience, A Cultural History of Whistleblowing and Fraud. His most recent book, How to Make a Killing, Death, Dollars, and the Business of Blood, published by Norton and Company, is what we're discussing today. Here's Tom's interview. Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for joining the podcast today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Tom, in your book, you argue that prioritising finance and profit in medical care has led to much higher mortality rates for US kidney dialysis patients. But in a sense, your book is a critique of the entire US medical healthcare system.
Yes. The fact is that we, I think, in America have conveniently bought into the notion, which really came into vogue with Reagan and Thatcher, that private does it better, government is part of your problem, that anything that isn't privately done smacks of socialism. These trends under Democrats and Republicans have gotten more pronounced over the decades. And at this point, most Americans, whatever their sort of politics, have bought into the notion, the objectively bizarre notion, that you can judge a medical company's results and its quality as a company by its share price and in return on earnings and profits, rather than how its patients do. And ultimately, shareholder value, that sort of mystique of the shareholder, has trumped patient care in many areas of American medicine, and particularly in dialysis, which is where I drilled down.
And what made you particularly turn your attention to dialysis?
Well, first, it's a really interesting kind of test case for Medicare for All. It was in 1972 when Richard Nixon signed it into law. It was widely believed that America would follow the rest of the developed world and have national health. In 1972, Australia did it. A lot of countries had just or were just about to do it. And Republicans, Democrats, the American Medical Association, the insurance companies, everyone had a very viable plan for how to do national health. And then Watergate swallowed Nixon, the Vietnam War dropped still further horrors. Carter came in, stagflation, the OPEC oil embargo, and immediately the government pivoted from building a better society, which is sort of, the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, carryover from the New Deal, to cost cutting. And that's where we've been ever since, essentially. Cutting costs has been the focus of attention. And cutting costs doesn't get you to the big picture national health as a right of citizens rather than something you have to pay for. That's kind of how we got there.
Because this 1972 law is a real pivotal moment. It could have marked the move towards national health care, some sort of system that was free for all. But despite that, it's unusual, I think, in the US that it does offer for nearly all US citizens care for patients with kidney failure.
It is extremely unusual. And again, on paper, it's a very good thing. Congress at the time in the late 60s and early 70s, when a viable treatment for kidney failure was introduced, Congress was faced with a very, very thorny problem. You had lots and lots of people who essentially had a death sentence. If you didn't get a transplant, which again was in its infancy and really not an option, you had kidney failure until dialysis was introduced, you died. That was it. And all of a sudden, a big fancy new machine was introduced that allowed people to live for decades and live rather well. But the problem is there's very, very limited supply. And so Congress was faced with lots of press on this and kind of epic-making Life magazine story, who lives and who dies.
This is because there just wasn't enough treatment, so doctors were having to make incredibly difficult decisions about who they should offer dialysis to and who they shouldn't.
Correct. They were denying treatment to the vast majority of patients who promptly went home and died. And so Congress got into the act and said, kidney failure is a threat to the American dream. We should fund this miracle cure. And they did. And on paper, that's a very good thing because, what is the government for if not to guarantee the right to life of its citizens? But in practice, when you have large for-profit corporations inserting themselves between the government on the one hand and patients on the other, the initial intent of the law can be badly skewed.
Now, early on, it seems that patients were dialysized more slowly than they are today, and that during that time, staff in the dialysis centres tended to have more advanced medical training. And that then began to change.
Yes, the initial treatments were all done in hospital or in carefully controlled hospital environments by registered nurses as the lowest, say, rung of expertise. Quite often there was stress on home dialysis. Quite often there was stress on slow, gentle dialysis over many hours. And that changed when the for-profit corporations really got rolling. Because frankly, if you can treat more patients and you're being paid per patient in a given time, you're going to make more money. And if your priorities are shareholder value first and foremost, or individual profit of the doctors who bought into this system, then you may tend to speed up the treatments.
And Tom, I should add that the one company who did respond to the allegations in your book, DaVita, said that the dialysis industry is strictly regulated by regulatory authorities whose various standards of care it meets or exceeds.
Yes, dialyzing patients more slowly is a very widely recognized part of healthy dialysis. The basic principle, and I'm going to do, MDs in the audience will cringe when I do this. Essentially, think of it as plumbing. Your vascular system is plumbing, your heart is a pump. If you attach an external pump to this system, which is essentially what you're doing, you're taking all the blood out of the body. This is hemodialysis. All the blood out of the body, filtering it, removing the liquids, and returning it to the body several times in the course of one treatment. If you do that gently and slowly, it's widely understood, widely proven to be healthier. And patients live longer. They have much, much better clearance rates, but they also have far fewer unpleasant and awful side effects. It's universally understood that that is the right way to do dialysis. However, if you're trying to create an assembly line and process as many patients as possible, which is essentially what big dialysis companies are doing, then you need to speed things up. And if you can get a definition of good dialysis, or they call it adequacy, I think it's a bad sign if adequacy is your gold standard. But in any case, adequacy and a certain measure of adequacy called KT over V. And it's essentially the measure of urea in your blood. Urea is one of dozens, scores of potentially toxic byproducts of metabolism that are floating around in your blood. Your normal kidney function just takes care of those 24/7. But urea is actually rather less toxic than many of the other molecules that are floating around in your body. It's much easier to dialyze out, water soluble. So it's not actually a very good model for the extent to which you're getting other toxins out of your blood, but it's easy to measure. And you can knock down urea very quickly with a high-speed, high-pressure dialysis system, which would then allow, as one Australian nephrologist said about the American system, KT/V, or the measure of urea in the blood, is the golden goose for corporations, because that allows them to say, look, we did our job. Look, their KT/V is low. Next, shuffle one patient out and shuffle the next patient into the chair and start the new treatment. If you did a proper job of measuring how well these patients were doing, you would slow things down and you would reduce the ultrafiltration rate, the speed at which excess fluid is removed from the blood.
So, what are the side effects that can occur when people have dialysis faster?
Yeah, there's a series of experiences that you have if you are dialyzed too fast, and high pressure, high ultrafiltration rate, headaches, nausea, sudden drops in blood pressure, horrible cramping, people screaming from the pain of the cramps. And that's because ultimately, I mean, a number of reasons, but one is that you're managing the fluids in your body badly. You're ripping off, the actual term that some dialysis caregivers use, ripping off the fluid too fast. And that does great harm in the short term. Longer term, heart failure, a series of other rather serious side effects that can be fatal. One of the main causes of death in American dialysis facilities, in these big, fast dialysis facilities, is a coronary arrest. And that's because, again, to come back to the plumbing analogy, your heart is a pump, and if you put too much pressure on it, it'll blow.
I must say, I had to read this page in the book twice when you mentioned that 22% of US dialysis patients die every year, compared to 9 to 12% in Europe. So almost double. And that seems extraordinary in a country with, at least nominally, some of the world's most advanced healthcare.
Yes, it is extraordinary. But again, if you come back to the measure, are people looking at how patients do or how the corporations are doing? Ultimately, I think when the for-profit move becomes a sort of a religion, and I think it is in the States, this notion that it has to be private, it has to be for-profit, and for-profit by definition is the noble way to go, then you can overlook these things.
I mean, looking at metrics for a successful company, that surely is one of the metrics I would be looking at as a patient. If I'm thinking, if I go to Europe, I've got half the death rate.
Yes, it would stick in your mind, wouldn't it? It's a matter of overall protocol, the overall treatment formularies that are used in these companies. So over medication and under medication. It's a matter of staffing, and staffing is an extremely important one. Understaffing is a chronic problem in American facilities, not nearly as much in Western Europe or in Japan or in Australia or in, well, anywhere else in the civilized world and the uncivilized world. But it's also the level of training of the people that you interact with, the number of patients that you as a nephrologist. So in America, there is a figure called the dialysis technician, and it sounds very kind of fancy, and they're working on the machines. No, they are the people who stick the 15-gauge needles into your major blood vessels. How much training do they have? Depends on the state, but they may have been flipping burgers 3 weeks ago. And now they're trying out their sticking skills on your lifeline, your dialysis fistula in your arm, where you insert the needles. This is a very delicate operation. This should not be done by someone who was flipping burgers 3 weeks ago. It sounds obvious when I say it, but unfortunately, in reality, it's not. In Europe, all of the stick and the other delicate procedures are performed by registered dialysis nurses. So not only registered nurses, but nurses who have an expertise in dialysis. And I know of a number of American patients who traveled to Europe and got dialyzed while they were in Ireland, while they were in the UK, while they were in Italy at a European facility. And they say, oh, they have such magic hands. These nurses are so great. The fact is, they are highly skilled medical professionals, and they're doing a delicate procedure. And then how many patients can a nephrologist have. In Germany, I believe the number is 30 maximum by law. You cannot have 31 patients. You have 30 patients and you get to know them and you follow their individual course of their disease, their individual biology, their individual treatment. You write their prescription every time. In America, there are dialysis centers and there are nephrologists who have hundreds of patients. And they do what is euphemistically called wave rounds. You can't do rounds properly on 100 patients, let alone 200. So they wave as they go by and they do the chart and, the techs and the nurses do what's necessary, but they're not doing particularized medicine tailored to those individual patients. They're doing the cookie cutter. They're doing what the corporation essentially passes down to them as the ideal, one size fits all treatment procedure. And frankly, that if it's passed on by the folks at finance rather than the folks in medicine, that can also be the one that makes them the most money. So ultimately, there are a bunch of different reasons why US mortality hovers around 22%, and Western Europe and Japan and other places, Australia and New Zealand and Canada, just north of the border last time I checked, are vastly better.
And staffing ratios while the patients are having the dialysis is another factor.
It's extremely important. Dialysis, even done well, is a high-risk procedure. It used to be done in hospitals where if something went wrong, you had an emergency room right nearby. Now it's, in America at least, widely done in malls and business parks where you're on your own. I've read logs of 911 calls, so the emergency calls, medical calls when something goes wrong, from dialysis facilities in California to the 911 operator saying, "Help, he's not breathing and his heart has stopped." And the operator says, "Well, use defibrillator." "We don't have one." "Get him on the floor and do CPR." I don't know how. A nightmare situation for something that ultimately should not be performed by people who don't know what they're doing. But yes, coming back to your question, staffing is extremely important. You need to follow these patients, even if done right. They may have sudden drops in blood pressure. A needle could become dislodged. If you are running around like someone in a MASH hospital during a war, which is what descriptions that I've heard often sound like, and people are coding and they're cramping and they're yelling or they go to sleep, but they may be bleeding, you need to be watching those people. And if you're understaffed, as often is the case, you're not going to catch people in time in many cases.
And I think, in fact, one of the big healthcare unions in the States has tried to follow up on complaints that people working in the organizations have made.
Yes, SEIU-UHW is a very, very good labor union based in California. And they, for the last 8 years, have been doing the deepest dive that I know of the quality of dialysis in America. And they have crunched the numbers. Those call logs are the product of their work. And they have hundreds of workers who ultimately are put in the position of having to contribute to their own patients' ill health because of staffing, because of the stress on money over patient care. And it's heartbreaking to speak with these people. I mean, many of them feel to me like they might have, moral trauma from what they're being constrained to do. But when you have two major corporations that control 80% of the market, which is essentially what you have with Fresenius and DaVita in America, there's sometimes only one game in town, two at the most. If you want to work in that field, you better follow their instructions. So it's difficult for workers. It's extremely difficult. And some are hardened by the situation and simply get on with the job.
And one thing that seems to have fallen away in the States, early on, there was a greater interest in home dialysis, which has many advantages for the patients. They can get on with their own lives much more easily. It's actually cheaper, but yet it's relatively rare in the States.
That's right. It's widely recognized to be the best form for those who can do it. It's a challenge to get trained up, but once you're trained up, you have much, much more control over your life. And this is true of kidney failure, but other chronic diseases as well. The more agency you have, the more control over your life you have, the healthier you will be psychologically as well as physically. So home dialysis really should be the goal. And in fact, under Donald Trump, Alex Azar, the head of Health and Human Services, basically penned a really visionary, and I hate that word, but it's true in this case, executive order, which Trump duly signed in 2019. And one of the key points in that was get everyone who can possibly do it on home dialysis. As you point out, Liz, it's cheaper, It's vastly better. You can do your own timing. You can work around your treatment rather than being a slave to schedules. But it doesn't fit with the cookie cutter assembly line business model of the big two. And so they may say, oh, yes, of course, we support that. But ultimately, patients aren't offered that when they come for treatment. Nephrologists quite often aren't even trained in home dialysis. They're not comfortable with the modality. Again, on paper, it's clearly the right choice, much cheaper for the taxpayer because ultimately the patient is paying the real estate, the utilities, they're doing the work themselves. But in practice, it makes less money for large dialysis corporations, and it hasn't been prioritized.
So ironically, Tom, before Wall Street money pouring into the dialysis industry, in the 60s and 70s, patients actually had better care in the US.
Right. Back in the 60s and 70s, when dialysis was being invented, essentially. The first machines came along during World War II, and some fascinating stories about these sort of Rube Goldberg devices cobbled together with bits and pieces.
Real Heath Robinson affair.
Heath Robinson affair, exactly. It's quite fascinating to see. But ultimately, those machines, even if they worked, and they used sausage casings to filter the blood and so on, they were pretty much a one and done solution. They were for people whose kidneys had stopped because of some traumatic event and were going to start again. Because each time you attach that machine to the human body, you basically destroyed a major blood vessel, and you ran out of those pretty quickly. So if their kidneys didn't jumpstart soon, they were done. That all changed in Seattle when Belding Scribner and colleagues invented the Scribner shunt. And that is essentially a way of implanting two tubes, very, very crudely put, in and leaving them in the arm, in this case, where you can attach and detach at will the dialysis machine. And that was improved into the fistula within a matter of years, which is a flexible kind of a balloon made by joining two major blood vessels under the skin. So it's even better than the Scribner shunt. But basically in the late 60s, early 70s, dialysis went from an emergency one-off treatment to viable chronic care. And in Seattle, their theory was long, slow, gentle dialysis at home, paid for by the community, strictly nonprofit. This is the model. And that, frankly, is really the model that Congress in 1972, or working up to 1972, proposed and bought into. Then there was the other model, which was put forward by doctors who had very, very distinguished nephrologists who had done their training at Harvard Medical School and been very distinguished, really, before nephrology was a thing. They were internal medicine experts who became nephrologists. And they spun off a corporation which became National Medical Care. Their proposal was the exact opposite. They really bought the approach of private does it better and profit is good. And they took the exact opposite. Let's make as many clinics as we can. Let's give the nephrologists who are head of these clinics a share in the profits. Let's run patients quickly. In fact, one of the doctors who is the head of this corporation also was the head of the medical trials that enshrined KT over V, that measure of urea, as the measure of dialysis adequacy. So it was convenient that turned out to be the corporate golden goose. And they became a giant. They rolled out a lot of clinics across the nation. They bought out a lot of doctors' practices, and they became the first dialysis giant and were swallowed by what is now Fresenius. But in the defense of the Boston model, the Boston and the Seattle model of those two, the nonprofit in Seattle and for-profit in Boston, in the defense of the Boston model, at first at least, their argument was, look, people are dying. There are lines out the door here. We don't have enough machines. Let's roll out as many clinics as possible. They were fine doctors. They certainly knew their medicine. And to a point, getting as many clinics going as possible was wise. I mean, it saved a lot of lives. At a certain point, however, the corporate consolidation of the industry and the intense focus on profit began to really cloud things. And that started in the mid-90s.
Now, one of the characters in your book is a whistleblower called Arlene Mullins, who set up a non-profit called Dialysis Advocates after she raised concerns about a dialysis clinic that she worked in.
Yes, Arlene was, again, as with many of the people that I interviewed in my book, some I named, some I couldn't name, someone who saw things from the inside, and she saw what happened when a great big corporation, in this case, the precursor to Fresenius, bought her dialysis clinic. And it went from one day to the next, the way she describes it, from all about patient care, building relationships with your patients, really getting to know them as people, because you spend, a lot of time with these people, right? 3 times a week, 4 hours a treatment.
Sure.
And really taking care of them. And those relationships lasted for a decade, 2 decades sometimes, because frankly, they were doing dialysis right. All of a sudden, a major corporation comes in, buys up the facility. And the way she describes it is they let half the people go. They fired a lot of the skilled people because they cost more. This is the way you think if you're a finance person. I used to work at Goldman Sachs. I know. And in certain places, it's absolutely appropriate. In healthcare, it is absolutely inappropriate. They started cutting costs on materials. They started shortening the treatment times. They started increasing the throughput, number of patients you treat per hour. And a lot of her patients died in short order. And she was horrified by this situation. First of all, she reported to the state healthcare. This is in Oregon. She reported her clinic and what was happening on an anonymous whistleblower hotline. And the next day was reprimanded for having made that call. So thank you very much, state officials. And she resigned and basically has devoted the rest of her life to getting help for patients who are in harm's way. And in particular, highlighting for me is one of the most nefarious things of this whole American dialysis system is involuntary discharge.
Arlene's perspective and what she alleges is that if patients raise concerns about their healthcare or are in any way seen as difficult in inverted commas by the staff, then the risk is they'll be told, we will not dialyse you any longer.
That's right. That's what Arlene says. That's what dozens, scores of other people said that I interviewed, both patients, caregivers, and dialysis advocates like Arlene. I should say that before publication, I sent a list of my stronger statements to the various corporations involved and whom I called out. And in several cases, they wrote back and said, all of this is rubbish, complete nonsense. We disagree. And so, I incorporated some of their concerns in my book. And I would just encourage readers to read the book, read the 60 pages of endnotes where I give my sources and decide for themselves.
Did they threaten you with litigation at any stage?
They suggested that some of the things that I was proposing to publish were libelous or inflammatory. But, I did my work. I double-checked my sources. I have many, many interlocking sources that say the same thing. And I stuck by my reporting as I do to this day. Given that the ideal business model for the big corporations, and again, I should say, each clinic is different. There are certain clinics run by these big corporations that are really doing good dialysis. And that's because one or more people in this clinic really put patients first. So I cannot generalize and say every clinic run by X company is doing these things. But when you make financial incentives very clear and make people's work and their careers depend on following the rules, you will tend to get certain results. And those results are that patients need to be unquestioning widgets on an assembly line, sit down, shut up, and give me your arm. All I want is your blood. These are phrases I've heard patients tell me their caregivers told them. Don't ask any questions. Don't raise problems. For God's sake, don't mention any problems to the state healthcare authorities. These are stories, and they're worst case scenarios, but they're stories that I've heard from hundreds of patients who are essentially being browbeaten into silence. The vast majority of those patients are also government insured patients. In other words, they're on Medicare or Medicaid or TRICARE. They're not privately insured. And why is that? Because privately insured patients are worth 3 to 10 times more than the publicly insured patients. And therefore, you have a class system in which private insured patients called HIPPers or high paying patients, I actually have an acronym for it. Are, the priority, right? And they are worth 10 times more. Guess who gets the better treatment times? Guess who gets the kid glove treatment? Well, they do.
Just to be clear, the one dialysis company, DaVita, that did respond to the allegations in your book said that it treats all its patients equally, whether their care is funded by private insurance or a government program. And Tom, you argue that if a patient is involuntarily discharged, it's not easy for them to get dialysis elsewhere. something the industry would also refute?
It's very difficult because you are flagged as reason for discharge involuntary. That goes on your medical records. It goes into what they call a Crown Web system. It's the data system that keeps track of dialysis patients. And other clinics don't want to take the chance. First of all, they know that you're not profitable or you wouldn't have been terminated in the first place. Second of all, you may be a questioner. I know that in America, there have been cases of patients who were genuinely threatened violence or did violence. I still haven't had, and I've challenged many people to give me one concrete example. I still haven't had one concrete example of a dialysis patient who was genuinely violent. I know it must exist.
Sure.
Everyone says, oh, but I can't talk about that because that's HIPAA. It's, the health care privacy law. It's always the same stuff. I know someone who had that happen to them. Like I know someone who died running around a pool with a lollipop in their mouth. Yes, but who did it actually happen to? No one can tell me. But I do know of a lot of cases, hundreds of cases in which patients were involuntarily discharged because they were accused of bringing a gun to the clinic or threatening to bring a gun. The first couple times I heard, threatened to bring a gun to the clinic or a knife, I thought, oh my God, well, this is America. Everyone has a gun. The fourth time I thought, boy, they don't seem like someone, they say they've never had a gun. The fifth time I thought, this is a playbook. This is the way you get rid of patients you don't want to have around.
That's obviously a pretty serious allegation. I know most of the companies you contacted didn't respond, but DaVita did, and it said that involuntary discharges of patients from dialysis clinics are rare, and in the event that such discharge becomes necessary due to patient behaviour, we are committed to supporting the patient's continuity of care and operating within the guidelines that CMS, the regulator, tightly monitors and governs.
I've talked with former and current, I'll say, regulators in inverted commas, because unfortunately the regulation at the state and the federal level has been largely hollowed out and largely captured by the industry. But regulators who say this is a big problem. This is a big problem, involuntary discharge. We didn't used to do this. It didn't used to happen. And now it's happening. There have been a series of studies that I cover in my book that show that it's ramped up almost in parallel with the concentration of the market as the big companies bought up the little companies from the 1990s through 2010. There was a spike in this. And if you think about it, just think about what happens, the crucible that many dialysis facilities have become. High pressure, understaffed, people being treated in fast bazooka dialysis, as one Australian nephrologist calls it.
And you argue that for people who are involuntarily discharged, the only option for them may be dialysis in the emergency room of a hospital, but that will only be done when they become seriously ill.
Yes, well, dialysis done properly is done regularly in an extended period of time. You don't have a huge buildup of fluid on the one hand and toxins on the other. If you do it in the ER, in the emergency room, they only treat you, generally speaking, when it's an emergency. When your health, your life is threatened by your blood values. And I've sat with patients who have been terminated from their dialysis clinic. No other area clinic would touch them. And they're condemned to dialyzing in the ER. I've sat with them for hours and hours, sometimes the entire day. Sometimes they don't get treated. The hospital staff will come, take blood, and then come back and say, sorry, you're not sick enough. Essentially, what they're saying is, you're not sick enough yet. When you're really on the verge of death, then we'll dialyze you. But the fact is, that kind of strain on the human organism is not good. Catching people at the precipice of death and dragging them back into life with dialysis is not the way dialysis should be performed. And those people typically, according to one very distinguished nephrologist whom I quote in my book, the people typically last 6 to 12 months and then they die. ER doctors are furious at this situation. It's very difficult to get solid numbers on how many people in America are being terminated or being involuntarily discharged from dialysis. But a way to measure it, a sort of a proxy way of measuring it, is how many people are being dialyzed in the emergency room. And there are undocumented people from Mexico and Latin America. And those are one called compassionate dialysis, which is another sickly euphemism. But then there are a lot of people who are just stuck dialyzing in the ER. And ER docs, apart from the fact that they say this is inhuman, this is wrong, they also say this is a horrible waste of our resources. We are here for emergencies. This is a chronic condition. They should be treated in a chronic care facility. And I can see one out my window. What's going on?
But Tom, what puzzles me is surely the nephrologists have a huge responsibility here. I understand commercial organisation wants to make as much money as possible, but nephrologists have an absolute duty of care. So surely they should be responsible for ensuring a patient gets a certain level of care, and they know what's appropriate care. So are they not ultimately the ones responsible?
Well, remember, the distinguished and highly skilled Harvard Medical School nephrologists were the ones who launched national medical care, the first great dialysis behemoth and the one who focused rigorously on profit. First of all, you have to understand that America really is about profit, and that is sort of a religion. And medicine by now has been completely subsumed by profit motive. Not completely, that's not right, but largely. And in many cases, people can feel good about themselves and sleep at night while putting profits first. But having said that, I quote a number of nephrologists in my book, some who allowed me to quote them with their names, others not, but who have had enough, who have seen what has happened, who took part in, at some level, the profit-seeking operation, in good faith, and then suddenly realized this is not just incompatible with my role as a doctor, as a healer. It is directly at odds with, it interferes with my ability to heal patients, to treat patients. A number of those nephrologists have really had enough, and they are speaking out. They've spoken out to me, they're speaking out to others, and I think the time has come. Unfortunately, things were so bad now that something has to give. Frankly, that's true, Liz, of not just of nephrology, of dialysis. It's true of the American healthcare system.
I'm sure you can argue that, Tom, but I think, if I'm a nephrologist and I'm looking at these mortality figures, 22% a year for US patients, 9 to 12 in Europe, that's such a bold statistic that, of course, there are other areas of healthcare, but that seems to be such an obvious example where it's so black and white, the difference between the two healthcare systems.
You're right, absolutely. And sensible nephrologists say that's wrong. But let me tell you how the other argument works, okay? They say, well, in America, we treat everyone, right? We take all comers, even with these terrible comorbidities of diabetes and hypertension and obesity and so on. Everyone gets treated, right? Whereas in socialized medicine, there are people who are weeded out and are not offered care. Now, I'll reverse that and say, in America, everyone gets hoovered into dialysis, including people who shouldn't be on it yet. Why? I'm rubbing my little fingers together here. There's one reason and one reason only. And the fact that people have comorbidities, that is true around the world. The fact that people are not given dialysis in certain cases, that is a good thing in the sense that they are offered dialysis, but all of the ramifications of dialysis, which is a tough treatment, are explained to the patient and the patient's family. And palliative care and simply not doing dialysis are options. Transplantation is also an option. Guess what happens to the level of transplantation when a big corporation buys out, or the two big corporations buy out a physician's practice? The number of people who are inscribed on the transplant list goes down. Why would that be? Well, because people who get a transplant are no longer your cash flow. This is a problem. So ultimately, it's possible to say, well, in America, we give dialysis to everybody, and that's why our death rate is so much higher. In reality, that's rubbish, because it's about the time of treatment, it's about the intensity and the speed of the treatment, it's about the staffing, it's about all these pieces that are crystal clear.
And it's completely inaccurate to suggest that in socialized medical systems, whether it's Europe, other places around the world, that patients are excluded. The whole point of those systems is that it covers everyone. That was their reason for being developed to begin with.
Yeah, I've never quite understood why Americans are so down on socialized medicine. It works pretty well. I live a lot of my life in Italy, and I'm telling you, it works pretty well.
Well, I know when I was making medical documentaries in the States, doctors would ask me about the UK's healthcare system, and they'd say, well, we wouldn't want it because we wouldn't want the government telling us what to do.
Yeah. So now you have the big corporations telling you what to do, or the insurance companies telling you what you do. People talk about bureaucracy, government bureaucracy. Well, some of the biggest bureaucracies in the world are corporate bureaucracies.
And there is a place in the States where actually you appear to have far better dialysis results, and that's in the Veteran Association hospitals, which are not run for profit.
That's right. The VA, the Veterans Administration facilities, are very much like socialized medicine. They are socialized medicine. Doctors are not paid according to the number of patients they treat. They paid a flat salary, and the standards of staffing are far higher, and patients get better care. Unfortunately, in many cases, those patients who are the veterans, right, on paper at least, are revered by America. Thank you for your service, are outsourced to the two big dialysis corporations for treatment. And some peer-reviewed studies have shown that they don't do nearly as well once they're outsourced.
I mean, I think you say that the veterans treated outside the association hospitals were nearly twice as likely to die in the first 2 years of dialysis.
Yeah, I say it because some very distinguished medical researchers say it. I just reading their peer-reviewed literature, and that's quite clear that veterans don't do as well once they are farmed out.
So that was seen a pretty clear example. You've got effectively the same population group in terms of their levels of illness, presumably, and you've got one group being treated within the Veteran Association hospitals who do much better, and the group treated outside who have nearly twice the death rate in the first 2 years.
Yes, I mean, epidemiologically, it's pretty watertight, isn't it? And in fact, one of the beauties of the dialysis situation in America, if you can use that term, is that data has been gathered in a rigorous way since the 70s because Congress is paying for this, right? So some distinguished economists, one in particular that I quote in my book and has really followed this, Ryan McDevitt, he's done studies that show what happens to patient outcomes, in other words, morbidity, mortality, when a private dialysis facility run by doctors is bought up by the big corporations. Patient mortality and morbidity go up. The number of people inscribed for transplants goes down. All the things, as Ryan McDevitt, the economist at Duke, says, all the things that could go wrong do go wrong, and everything tilts towards profit. Again, it's a very neat exercise in comparing before and after, and you have the same patients, same location, same everything. It's just that someone else is calling the tune.
And ethnic minority communities seem to be at particular risk of kidney failure. And you mentioned that, for example, African Americans make up 13% of the population, but are 35% of the kidney failure patients.
Yes. Part of this is genetic. There are certain APOL1 allele. If you have 2 copies of that, you're more likely to have kidney failure. Part of it is environmental. Food deserts produce the big 3, obesity, diabetes, and hypertension, which are the drivers of much of kidney failure. But yes, Black Americans and Native Americans and Pacific Islanders and Hispanics, and to a lesser degree, other minorities, are heavily hit by dialysis, by kidney failure to begin with, and then by bad dialysis. And I had one really wonderful registered nurse, Magellan Hanford, who I quote in my book extensively. He was formerly a Los Angeles Police Department officer. He had gunfights with drug gangs in East LA. I mean, this is someone who has seen a lot of life. And he said that life on the blood floor, which is a technical term, of a dialysis facility, in his view, was even tougher. He talks about how a dialysis clinic, like fast food, like payday loans, like gold for sale, sell your gold, are sentinel presences in underserved communities, in disadvantaged communities.
It's a pretty depressing picture that in poorer neighbourhoods, you've got a lack of fresh food stores, loan companies, lots of fast food outlets, and dialysis clinics.
It's not a pretty picture, and it is, I think, the face of structural racism in American medicine. I really got an eye-opener when I tried at various times to get lawyers involved in helping patients who were being threatened with or who had been terminated from care by their facilities. And one of the lawyers who had the most understanding for this was John Hanlon, who had previously worked at the Innocence Project, which is Black death row inmates. Observed when I described the situation with involuntary discharge, particularly for patients of color. He said, "Oh, I get it. This is another death row. This is incarceration, right?" And I had never thought of bad dialysis as a form of incarceration, but all of a sudden it became clear to me that he was absolutely right.
Now, A Senate subcommittee did look into the big dialysis industry back in 2000, but nothing much seemed to change.
No. Chuck Grassley and colleagues called a hearing. Dialysis patients in America at undue risk? You had a series of very impressive witnesses, both medical professionals and patients, describing a situation which is not that different from what I'm describing in my book. Patients who are threatened with discharge, who are browbeaten, who better not question their care. In one case, Brent Smith told Chuck Grassley, when I go back to my clinic in Arizona, I'm afraid of what's going to happen. I may not be very popular. And Chuck Grassley got very outraged by this. So you're a federal witness. This is outrageous. If there's any problem, you just let me know. He had received calls from senior officials from the company just before he testified, who insisted on speaking with him while he was dialyzing, which is a sort of a vulnerable situation.
This seems an incredibly complex problem to solve. If I gave you carte blanche, what would you do?
I'm glad you asked that question. I have a list. I've made a list. How to fix dialysis in America. And it's not all that hard. First of all, we talk a lot in America about competition, about free markets. Well, this market is the exact opposite of competitive free market. Two colossal giants who control 80% of the business, who stick to their guns in terms of their business model, and control not only the lives of patients, but also of workers, of nephrologists. This is not competitive. So fix that. Then go through the various measurements that the CMS, the government healthcare authority that keeps track of dialysis, or should be. Frankly, they're asleep at the switch most of the time. Length of dialysis, low UFR, low blood pump speed, which is actually what pulls it out and pushes it back in, and a set of other measurements are currently being collected by CMS, or they're talking about collecting them, but they're not penalizing facilities that violate best practices. Start doing that. I mean, if we know that slow, gentle dialysis is better, and you're measuring and figuring out who's doing it and who's not, penalize or put out of business the ones that are not. As a series of very straightforward steps that has to do with economic incentives and just basic best practices that need to be put into place, but they're not all that difficult. That's the thing about American dialysis, is so bad that almost everybody agrees it needs to be fixed. And if you did home dialysis, another really big push, you would save billions of dollars, on the order of $150 billion a year with public and privately insured patients. $150 billion. If you put vast majority of those patients into home dialysis, and I don't mean push, I mean encourage them and train them, they would get better care. And the taxpayer would get a lot more bang for their buck. I mean, the prices would be infinitely smaller. So I have made that list. It is available, and this is fixable. And I think it just is a matter of political will and organization to make it happen. I think, again, things have gotten so bad in American dialysis that people are ready for a change. Even the big companies are saying, whether they overstretched and then COVID hit them in the back of the neck, even the big companies are suffering right now. So time for change.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for sparing the time to talk today. Really fascinating.
Thank you, Liz. It's been a pleasure.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the show, if you could leave a review, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.